All right, welcome to those of you joining us live on Facebook or maybe from the future watching this recording. We are First Matter Press, and this is our second episode of the 2022 Convos and Cohort, and we're going to get started here.
All right, so we're going to begin this evening with a land acknowledgement. We are curating this conversation from Portland, Oregon, traditional and ancestral lands stolen from the Multnomah, Clackamas, Chinook, Cathlamet, Tualatin Kalapuya, Malala, and many other tribes and bands of the Columbia and Willamette regions. We respect that acknowledging Indigenous people as the original stewards of these lands since time immemorial is not enough. Action and investment are required. May this recognition of harm seed communal roots of active engagement and relationship building toward healing the ongoing traumas of settler colonialism. We invite everyone now to acknowledge all the original Indigenous stewards of the land you currently live on in our chat if you so choose.
Okay, thank you, Lauren. And now we thought we'd start off with a little bit about our press. First Matter Press, you can see all our beautiful covers there too. First Matter Press is a writers collective in Portland, Oregon, founded in 2018 to dissolve publishing barriers for first-time publishing poets and genre-expanding writers. With 17 titles available or in production, our annual releases center community and craft by inviting authors into creative cohort, where they crystallize manuscripts in dialogue with editors and fellow writers, and collaborate with featured artists on original cover art. First Matter Press is a registered 501c3 nonprofit organization, and our authors maintain 100% of copyright and sales royalties of their published work. Currently, our editors include Ash Good, Lauren Paredes, Carolyn Wilcox Royal, and Emily Moon.
My pleasure to introduce this year's cohort. Ahuva S. Zaslavsky is the author of Between These Borders Wanders a Golem. Hailey Spencer is author of Stories for When the Wolves Arrive. Riley Danvers is author of Even the Air, Too Heavy. Sonia Wolitz is author of One Row After, Bin Sira Sonra. Xylophone Micklin is author of Someone I Can Hold Gently. And this year's featured cover artist is Rachel Mulder. She did a fabulous job with all of our lovely covers.
Thanks so much, Emily. So this is our second conversation of this year's Convos and Cohort, and this is a reading and discussion series that our press founded last year with last year's group of authors, where we discovered this really sweet little spot where the authors could share their work and then also dig into all of the overlaps of themes that we found between these manuscripts, which feels really exciting when you're working in collaboration with people to see what's coming out in your own work that you see reflected back to you and others. So tonight we have Riley Danvers, Ahuva Zaslavsky, and Hailey Spencer here to share some work. So the format of the evening will be that they read some work out of their book for us, and then we'll move on to a discussion between the three of them. I would invite anyone who's here with us in the Zoom to feel free to use those response buttons or even reflect lines back in the chat that really speak to you. If you're live with us on Facebook, we also are watching those comments over there, so feel free to interact. And in either the Zoom chat box or the Facebook comments area, feel free to drop any questions there, and the editors can feed those into the conversation as it's happening later. So I will move to introducing our first author.
Okay, it is my honor and pleasure to introduce Riley Danvers, author of Even the Air Too Heavy. Poet C.T. Salazar, he's the author of Headless John the Baptist Hitchhiking, wrote this of Riley's work. Reading Even the Air Too Heavy is a process of witnessing how grief transforms us and must in turn be transformed into poetry, into lyric. Hailey Danvers has transformed indescribable injury, giving music where otherwise there is silence. Where the poet locates loss, she centers revelations of an interconnectedness beyond our individualism. So I'm very happy to present to you all Hailey Danvers.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Carol. Thank you, Ash, and everyone at First Matter Press. I'm so excited to be here. The first conversation in Cohort was fantastic. So I'm very, very excited about tonight. So I'm going to be reading 3 different poems from my book. The first poem I'm starting with is called Kaleidoscope. I strain my eyes across this ocean, peel back time to remember when I contained cherry air, before you gave way to the storm that rocked your anchors, before I housed only unmet dreams. Because of you, I want to cling to moments reminding me I once held more than regret. I am always running after you. I am deathbed and graveyard. My next poem is called Body Language. Right eye twitches. Something has come alive in my body, died in my body, made rapid by rumination, regret. My stationary body unfurls, twitches, too full of wings, too full of fire-filling forests, too full of stitches, a kettle heating, water boiling, steam screaming, stationary body too full of its aching self, body too full of body, too full of too much, empty. I am alive because I am what has died. I am alive because I have held what has died. Muscles moving in time with time, synapses firing off, sounding, marching, jerking, twitching, switching off. Maybe this means I no longer know how to speak the language of the living. My last poem is my title poem, Even the Air Too Heavy. I held your shape, arms folded across chest, supported your disappearance. I woke a heat in my arms, a cadenced desert of smelted vanadium, clapping cymbals clamoring in desecrated wind. My bones lamented what I would never hold. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hailey. That was beautiful. I'm so excited now to introduce Hailey, who I had the pleasure of working with on this book, Stories for When the Wolves Arrive. From Sonia Vitomsky, author of Salt is for Curing, and one of Hailey's personal heroes, which we're so happy to get a blurb from. This is what she had to say about Hailey's book. Hailey Spencer's remarkable debut shows us what fairy tales are made of. Both butcher and baker, Spencer strips the flesh of wordplay from the bones of motif and archetype, kneads rhyme until elastic, and feeds the snake of metaphor to itself. Stories for When the Wolves Arrive is recursive like trauma and glorious like recovery. You'll want to follow this breadcrumb trail to the end. All right, and happy to introduce Hailey now to read some work.
Thank you, Lauren. The Sleeping Princess. 1. A fairy casts a curse on a young princess. With no spindles in the kingdom, production comes to a halt. The king's velvet cloak grows stiff and unsmooth. The queen's veil is covered with pockmarks. The tailors tear the curtains from the princess's canopy to sew her ballroom gown. 2. The princess falls into a 100-year sleep. In her dream, she carries a spindle between her hands. She wanders through the woods as she works, spinning a long golden chain. For fear of losing it, she uses a sailor's knot to anchor one end to her ankle. 3. A prince awakens her with a kiss. She screams, but the rest of the kingdom is still waking. She can no longer remember the dream, only fragments that occasionally light up in her mind like pebbles under moonlight. 4. They are married that same day. Afterwards, when the prince is asleep in their bed, the princess wanders the castle. Those who come across her in her nightgown with her gray and brittle hair believe they have seen a ghost. In the mornings, these encounters go unmentioned. The spindle and the sleep. This story of a princess who, in sleep, fell into dreams carnivorous and deep, those gray-soaked days when all she did was weep. A dozen fairies saw her birth and cry, but one in anger raised her wand up high. Her curse, at age 16, the girl would die. Another of the guests cast through her tears a spell that fell on many grateful ears. She would not die, but sleep 100 years. So when the princess reached that dreaded age, she wandered through the halls and met a sage. This crone was spinning threads of finest gauge. The princess pricked her finger, took a fall, and landed on a bed. Around its walls, the castle grew a thicket, firm and tall. For years, proud princes worked hard to break in. Swords pierced the brambles, almost there, but then the thicket thickened and they could not win. The time arrives, a new prince and a kiss. The princess wakes into a certain bliss, back to a life she hadn't known to miss. That evening, they are married in the hall. A feast, a frock, a dance, a royal ball. The princess says she doesn't mind at all. Doesn't mind at all. A chrysalis wrapped up in silken dreams longs to dissolve inside herself. Blue twilight through the woods, a body that is not her body. Even the careful steps of spiders against the skin of her wrist cannot make her emerge. It is only the rustle of brambles against glass that wakes her, soft vibrations through her chest. She does not know when in this story she is. A spindle sharp against her finger, silk spun tight around her throat. The true bride. Even after the end of the story, when she lies in his arms, whispers drifting across her skin, safe, safe. She dreams of stone walls coming closer, cutting off her airways as beetles climb through dark cracks in the walls. She wonders if she could fit through those holes. The prince snores in their bed, untroubled by the stain in the courtyard that no one has been able to scrub out. It's harder to forget than she'd expected. In the morning, she stares at her reflection, where new growth of nettles has emerged in the places where the bread knife sawed through hair. A life that is her own. And after the end of the story, when he's kissed her and she's awake and the birds and deer cry out, safe, safe, she makes herself a home inside the woods. A cottage at the edge of a meadow with a winding path that leads away toward dark places she has never been. She feels no need to follow it. There is no sugar-spun facade, no wolf lying in wait, no glass coffin, only moss-covered wood and the redeeming light that spills in through the cracks of the sky. The prince has traded in his crown. The desert to the south is full of the past, and she doesn't mind. In the morning, she glances at her reflection, where a coronet of vines has begun to form against the ripples of her hair. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that, Hailey. It's my pleasure to introduce our next writer, Ahuva Zaslavsky, the author of Between These Borders Wanders a Golem. And this is what Jay Ponteri, the author of Someone Told Me, had to say about Ahuva's book. Between these borders wanders a golem, shows great variation in form, method, and visual composition. Language is used to compose visually through handwritten diary entries, hybrid pieces combining prose and verse, styled text and design elements to add thematic depth. All of it orienting the reader to the anxiety of all these speakers, those wandering golems, all seeking out shape in their misshapen lives amid climate crisis, loneliness, and COVID. In the opening poem, the speaker asks, what quickens? Time quickens, grief quickens, feeling quickens, seeking quickens, and so does language and the revelatory prowess of the language expresses. Ahuva S. Zaslavsky has made an incredible first book. Welcome, Ahuva.
Hi, everyone. I'm so happy to be here. Thank you for that. I am going to read 2 buckets from the physical book. 2 buckets. I accompanied him to the train station. It was a hot day, and all of the words I wanted to say felt voluminous. Like if they came out of my mouth, they would dry out and drop. He was leaving. Down in the station, things got dark. As we entered this humid cave, everything was wet. The floors, the walls, the sounds. He was walking fast, and I tailed after him like a child. Our shoes made sloggy noises. Did he want me to follow him here? Or maybe I had made him ask me to come. The point is, I didn't want him to go. It wasn't love for sure, nor attraction, I think. I just really wanted to stick to him. Something with his skin. When we moved together, I would purposely rub my hand against his just to feel it. Waiting for the train, he was holding an unusual baggage in both hands. 2 industrial buckets with metal handles. I could see the pressure marks creasing his fingers from all this weight. I don't know why he didn't set them down on the ground while waiting, but I remember thinking this was his way to look occupied. Maybe he also wanted to stick with me, but didn't know how. Both buckets were full to the rim with dark brown and gooey fluids like a thick stew of filthy chunks of meat. Every time he leaned on one of his legs to release some tension, jello fluids giggled. It was disgusting. The thing is, I don't remember seeing it this way when we were out in the sun. And also, looking back, I don't understand why it was so important to him to carry these buckets into the station. There we stood, buckets full and empty mouths. I had things to say, but only stood very quiet. I just stared into his eyes, looking even darker down in this underground station. The way they looked back threw me to a far childhood moment. I am not older than 5 years old. I know because I stand very close to the men and my head reaches his very short jeans, the kind that men dared to wear in the 70s. So it is the 70s and I am not older than 5. The men's blue jeans end at the top of his thighs. All 3 of us stand in the center of the living room. It is summer. I know this because of the shorts and the open windows and the blue skies pouring in. They are laughing at something I don't understand. Their mouths are wide and I can see their upper jaws and teeth. Their voices sound distant, echoing like the sounds did in the train station. I stand closer and hug one hairy leg, and while I look up to them, I reach my hand up and my little palm grabs his peanuts, squeezing the shorts' rough fabric. I see darkness clouds his light blue eyes, and he pushes both of us and leaves. My memory tricks me now. Where did he get these buckets? He didn't arrive with them. We were always together, and I know he didn't buy them. Maybe they were mine? I suppose it is possible. It was so long ago, I cannot tell. I only remember it took the train a long time to arrive. All this time we didn't talk. We just looked at each other. Suddenly, two famished dogs appeared from one of the black tunnels, rushing towards us with starving eyes. At the exact moment, I stepped very close to him, and in my most gentle voice, I whispered into his ears, "Why don't you put the buckets down?" And so he did. The dogs devoured the filthy meat. We hugged, bodies so close, as if merging, until the train arrived. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ahuva. We're now going to move into our conversation portion of the evening. And we're going to begin with this question for you all to chew on here. What role does trauma play in your work?
It's such a big question. It's hard to know where to start.
It's true. I mean,
Yeah,
go ahead.
No,
No,
you go first. You go first.
Okay. I mean, I think mine is pretty self-explanatory, and just the content of my book, obviously being about pregnancy loss and infertility and the struggle with that. I don't know. I guess I'm trying to think of something that's like less obvious and straightforward than just like, yeah, I wrote about trauma. That's how it plays a role in my book. But I'm coming up empty, so.
I think to me, the whole process of writing is actually trying to uncover layers of trauma, things that I know that I might know, I don't know, but I want to know, or I know and I don't want to know. So in a way, I think if it was like a ball game, trauma would be in the middle between me and the writing. Like I'm passing the ball and I'm trying to catch it, but I'm also not catching it. It's a very slippery, a trauma is a very slippery thing for me. It's obvious, but it's not. And I don't want it to be too obvious also. Because we all have trauma, right? What is trauma? Trauma is such a big word today. Everyone talks about their trauma. We all experience trauma in the present or experienced in the past. So it's there and we don't want to shout it, but we also want to express it. How I feel about that.
Yeah, I know at our very first cohort meeting when we were introduced, the editors said that the word that they would use to describe like all of our books together was underbelly. And I think another word that I would use for all of our books is excavate. I don't think any of us are just looking at the surface of trauma. I think a lot of us are interested in looking through trauma and around trauma and over trauma. And I know fairy tales have always fascinated me for that reason. That, I mean, fairy tales are in many ways trauma narratives, and they're very oftentimes straightforward about it, but in a way that's so straightforward that it's almost working around it instead. It's a little bit difficult to explain just like how I see trauma in fairy tales, but it's almost dreamlike.
I really love that. And I have to say to both ahuva and Hailey, it occurred to me as you both were talking there, in one of the poems you read, Hailey, there's a line where when the princess wakes up, she doesn't know what story she's in anymore. And then in ahuva's piece, there's a line that says, my memory tricks me now. And this to me is like the personification of trauma. It's disorienting. It displaces. It almost picks us up and drops us into a different reality. And I think, as ahuva said, the process of writing through trauma helps to reorient. It helps to get us out of that disconnected space and back into, whether it's a psychic or emotional or physical or all of those things, it's a reconnecting.
It's true, because I feel like we always talk about healing from trauma, and I personally don't think we can heal from it. It can never go away. I think we need to learn how to live next to it or give it a hand. And I think writing around it or about it in each, in different ways, it's like really giving a hand to the trauma, right? And accepting that it's there without trying to say, oh, I'm trying to recover, I'm trying to let it go, because it's never going to go. It's always there.
Oh, that's fascinating, ahuva. You might have just completely changed my entire view of the world right there. I have to think and process. Oh my gosh. Well, that was beautiful though.
Well, what are fairy tales if not processing in a cultural way, in a collective way? Because we're not inventing traumas and disasters, right? They're part of humanity. We process it over and over through stories. And Hailey, I think your book brings this like archetypical trauma or like ancestral trauma, right? So I think that's what fairy tales does. And I think, Riley, you're on the other side. In a very tricky way, you're talking about a very concrete trauma. And the way you write it, almost every person can relate to it, because it's not really about, is it really about the concrete event, or is it about the under layers that lives in the body through that? It's the actual pain, it's the physical pain.
Yeah, and I want to touch on something you said about cultural trauma in fairy tales. In Robert Darnton's The Great Cat Massacre, he has a chapter about fairy tales as a way of understanding the French peasantry. And he talks about people trying to do all of these, like, Freudian readings, psychosexual readings, like all these different readings of a story like Hansel and Gretel. And he's talking about that. And he's like, but from a historical standpoint, this story was really big in 17th century France. And there were also lots of famines then, and lots of starvation, and lots of families who had to send their kids away. And so often we're looking for something in these stories. We're trying to add something to these stories that we don't need to.
Are you saying that readers are reading things into the fairy tales that we don't need to? Is that what you meant?
Somewhat, but also like within scholarship, and especially certain kinds of fairy tale scholarship, it's really easy to search for traumas that feel big enough to us now, or feel like they're supposed to look a certain way to us now, versus looking at just like human realities. Like starvation is a human reality. not being able to support your kids is a human reality. And so often we're like, well, if these stories are so meaningful, like, what does this story mean? And it's actually often very straightforward. But I think there's part of us that doesn't quite want it to be so straightforward. I don't know. I don't have like a full thesis about this yet. I'm throwing some thoughts at the wall right now. I would love to hear your takes on that.
Well, I think you can look at fairy tales. We learn to think about fairy tales as something that a lesson for humanity, how to avoid trauma, how to avoid unpleasant events, right? If you behave X, you will not experience this terrible thing that the princess experienced, right? But in fact, we can look at it as a collection of event, true or not, that kind of like teaches us what humanity is made from, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's not just about an educational or didactic lesson.
Mm-hmm.
It has much more in it.
Absolutely, because fairy tales aren't about people who don't go into the woods. They're about people who go into the woods and come out changed.
Right.
And I think that's what trauma is about too.
Yeah. Oh,
Right. And if you look about writing as the woods, that's what we're trying to do, right? We're going into the woods of words and poems and writing. And we hope to come out maybe a little bit changed, or I don't know what else can it be. But I guess it changed me, like the whole practice of writing and trying to process my own issues, you know?
well, and just speaking from my own experience, I can attest to this one experience, or two rather. I had two miscarriages, literally started my journey of deconstructing basically everything that I had been led to believe up to that point. So my trauma literally made me look at my religion. It made me look at my political views. It made me look at my views about like things that I had just taken for granted as being true, and helped me kind of like look beyond the like rose colored glasses that I had been wearing my entire life. And that's not to glamorize the trauma in any way, but just in the process of trying to figure out why did this happen to me, it broadened my entire understanding of the world and completely changed me. So whether it's writing is the woods, or trauma is the woods, or just life in general is the woods, and the writing and trauma happens inside of it, I think that change is, I mean, it's the constant in all of that.
I also think I really agree with you, because I also think trauma and writing about it, it's almost like a paradox, because it's like, I see trauma as like the unspeakable event, right? You cannot really talk about it. You cannot really have words around it. And we are trying to go against the stream and actually rename things. And you use the word deconstruct, but also it's about how we use words to rename experience. I don't want to say horrible, but really painful experiences, or reword them, reverbalize them in different ways. And because it's so hard, I think we keep doing it all the time. We repeat it over and over.
Yeah, I'm thinking about an essay by John Green that I was listening to recently, where he says there's a certain way that I talk about the things I don't talk about. And I think about that a lot in terms of the work of this group. Like, I'm thinking about Riley, your poems that are so beautiful and talk about this subject in such amazing ways, but also, for the most part, you don't use a lot of words related to miscarriage. You leave a lot of it unspoken. And ahuva, in your work too, there's a lot of things that you have to dig for and excavate a little bit more. And I think absolutely that's what trauma is like. And it is that paradox. We're talking about it and we're not talking about it.
I love that, Hailey, because I see that in your work too, and how we have the poems that are more explicitly about the fairy tale. And then there's the different renditions of the fairy tale that start to kind of unravel a little bit. And while it always is still the fairy tale, it's also more and kind of like the unspoken, that because the fairy tales I think are so explicit, there is a lot that is either assumed or just kind of in between the lines. And I love to see the way that those fairy tales unravel and kind of open up to include more. And I think that's just really beautiful, the way that you are able to accomplish that.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's true. It's like what you're doing in with the tales are actually, we all know them, right? We're familiar with them, but you kind of like say, let me tell you how it really is, right? And you bring other things to it that are so unexpected, you know?
Almost to the point that, like, if it weren't for the actual fairy tales listed and it was just a book of the other poems, I might not actually know if they were based on fairy tales, which I think is beautiful and brilliant, because it allows some of that nuance and ambiguity that I think poetry kind of requires. But then because we have those fairy tales, we can see the thread. We can see, you know, the pieces that are constant through all of the poems. I mean, the fact that that writer said, you know, there's the breadcrumbs in their description of your book, like, that is just absolutely perfect, which is just masterful. I mean, it's like you've written all of these fairy tales yourself. It's brilliant.
That makes me really happy to hear, because one of my goals during this process, and something I really struggled with some of the more familiar stories especially, was the concept of defamiliarizing. Because we all have, I mean, for many of these stories, we all have such clear ideas in our head of what they are, that it can be almost difficult to move away from what we think we know about them.
Yeah, I can imagine.
I'm trying to think about why is it so hard to talk about this today, and how we go back to Hailey's fairy tales. And I think this is our anchor. This is like, we all share it, right? In our minds, this is actually what fairy tales do, right? They let us process things not through us, but through stories. And I feel like when I'm trying to think about where trauma comes in my work, I'm like, oh, I don't know if I want to talk about it. Let's go back to Hailey's fairy tale.
But your work tells the stories with trauma so masterfully as well. I mean, you know, my probably favorite part of the whole book is the story called Lagrange Point. Yeah, that is my favorite part of your whole book. And that story is so interesting to me because of how much the trauma is there, but you're kind of letting the reader do more of the excavating. You're not including too many of the people's feelings, but a lot more, you know, it's like things they're jotting down on pieces of paper and napkins and things like that. And we're trying to piece together something that clearly has so much trauma embedded in it.
Thank you. I do find myself prefer to tell the story through the surrounding, the space, than the core of my intention. I feel like describing through objects, through inventing people and characters, but also spaces and places that I think are metaphorical for the traumatic event. I feel like this is an easier way for me to do that. And I think part of the reason is that my background is actually from, I studied behavioral science, so psychology, and I'm really digging psychology, but also sociology. So I like that kind of theories about it. I like to have a platform of knowledge theory that I can play with the traumatic stories that I want to say, but not in an explicit way, if that makes sense.
I mean, the phrase that comes to mind for me reading your work is negative space. Like, especially the stories, I feel like you're creating the space around the trauma and letting the trauma sit as negative space.
I really like that. Thank you.
I absolutely agree with that 100%.
One thing I'm curious about, because I know Ahuva, you just said, you know, background in behavioral science. Riley, do you have any background in like trauma theory or things like that? I'm just curious, like where we're all coming from with that kind of information.
That's a great question. I don't know. I mean, my entire background has been really just in literature and writing and creative space. Although one of my teachers in undergrad told me that there is a form of therapy called bibliotherapy, where people use reading and writing as forms of like working through trauma and using them as therapeutic practices. And I have found that reading poetry is extremely therapeutic for me, almost more so than writing my own poetry. I don't know if that counts as trauma theory, but like there's something just very soothing, I think, in, you know, number one, just being trusted by so many amazing poets with their experiences and their emotions, but also in the connections that take place. Because I think people who write and people who create so often have pain that is just either unacknowledged or unspoken, or depending on who they are, it could be pain that is just completely denied, and people just don't even believe that it happens or that it exists. And so when we are trusted with a creator's experience, I think that it's natural for other people who've been through trauma to hold space for that.
Yes, and also I think the poetic language is so ambiguous and wide that reading other poetry and the reader can relate to the essence of things without really maybe understanding what the poet meant, right? Because you are allowed to take it and transform it into your own experience. And so, and that's what makes it so universal, because the experience is universal, the words are universal. It's about how we use these words together in order to describe our own experiences. So I think when it's good, then you can relate to it, right? Because we're not inventing the experience, we're just describing it.
I absolutely.
Oh, you can go, Riley.
Sorry. I absolutely agree with that. It makes me think of this book. It's called Toxicon and Arachne by Joelle McSweeney. I read that poetry book one time through, and then a mentor in my MFA program suggested it to me, and I read it through a second time. And it wasn't until the second time that I realized that she was writing about having a stillborn child. And the writing was so interesting. To this day, I'm still not entirely convinced that that's what it's about, just because the writing seems so disjointed from that subject matter. And yet, while I was reading it, I did get the sense of there being something within the body that was heavily traumatic. So I completely understand what you were referring to there, Ahuva.
Yeah, I'm also just thinking about language exists to help us communicate thoughts, but also experiences. And trauma is one of the places where language kind of fails us. Like either I just read The Body Keeps the Score, and he talks a lot about like the inability of the traumatized person to talk about their trauma and how like something inside of us prevents us. But then also, even when we are able to talk about our trauma, often the words aren't helpful, and words can't actually explain the experience of what it was like to be there and to be that person in that place at that time. And I think that because of the figurative nature of poetry and more hybrid works, it can sometimes be easier. I think there's some shortcuts that you can take by not describing the thing exactly as it is.
Mhm. Yes,
Or
it's,
even,
oh, no, go ahead.
I was just gonna say quit, like, or just completely reimagining it into something different altogether, but still holding on to the truth of what happened.
Right. Yeah, and what's wonderful about the book you just mentioned, the Body Keeps the Score, is also the solution for that is again creative, right? It's not about going to therapy or doing X, Y to heal yourself. It's exactly about living alongside with it and processing it through the creative process path.
Yeah. And the emphasis is really, it's not on getting back to a life where this never happened. It's about getting to a life where you can live with the fact that this happened. And it's a part of your story, but not your whole story.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that writing has taught me more than anything. It's that healing is a process, it's not a destination. And like you said, learning to live with it. I think Ahuva said, like, living alongside it, having it, like, living adjacent to it, almost like a neighbor, you know, part of your vicinity, part of your life, but not the defining factor, which I think, and I know when I first like started my healing journey, I thought that like, okay, there's going to be a day where I wake up and this isn't going to bother me anymore. I'm not going to think about it. It's going to be like it never happened. And it's just not true. It's just not how things work. Which is why I think writing and creativity in general are so important, because they allow that existence, but in a way that is not continually damaging.
Mhm. You know, I had an artist visit today at school, and he said something that really comes back to me now, because we talked about memories, but I think about it in relation to trauma, and I think he said something that we are allowed to manipulate our memories, but we can also manipulate our trauma, right? We can change it in the way, tell ourselves the narrative in different ways until we almost can believe it, right? And I think through writing and rewriting, we can manipulate the trauma, we can trick it, we can, you know, change it in the way we can actually really be able to live with it.
This conversation is making me think about why I chose the last two poems that I chose to read, The True Bride and A Life That Is Her Own, which I'm sure you noticed as I was reading them are very similar poems to the point of having some identical lines even. But in The True Bride, which is at the end of part 2 of my book, which is very like deeply embedded in the trauma of, that this book is telling, the section is called The Heart's Trap. And, you know, she can't forget the things that have happened. The places where she's cut off her hair are growing nettles. She's kind of losing it. She's got this prince who, like, she's clearly not that excited about him being there. And then A Life That Is Her Own, it's very similar. Still after the end of the story, she's still thinking about what has happened. She still can't let go of it. But at least what I was going for is like, you know, I have the line, the desert to the south is full of the past and she doesn't mind. Like, she lives alongside it, is there. She's made a home in the woods. So part of why I wanted to read those is because I feel like that's so much part of the cycle of trauma, is getting from the place of I'm trapped, I can't let go of these memories, this is terrifying, to these memories are here, they matter, you know, I live within them and alongside them, and it's okay.
I love that wording, Hailey. I think so often the like behavior around trauma is that it was painful, therefore we must escape from it. It was painful, therefore we have to find a way of getting away from it. And when you said, you know, these experiences happened, they matter. The experiences matter, the memories matter. And I think the impulse to push away anything that was painful, while an understandable impulse, can detract from the very real beauty that comes from making a home in the woods. That is such a beautiful image to me. I love it.
I so agree with you. I really liked what you said about it's almost the two poems that are almost the same poem. It's just an evidence of how it's a compulsive act, right? We have to repeat it over and over. And I was thinking, why did I choose the two buckets? And I think I did the same, like exactly like you. I told and retold the same story in a different way. It just ends a little different. And that's the manipulation. I can change the end, or I can give it a different flavor, or I can recreate the event in a more livable way. And I think this act of repetition is so important in processing. And what's more repetitive than actually holding a pen and writing over and over the same, you know, words.
There's a really amazing book. You mentioned repetition. Absolutely phenomenal book. I cannot remember the name of the person who wrote it, but it's called Slater Orchard. It's a short novel, and the writer uses repetition over and over and over. It's just like, sometimes it's words, sometimes it's images, sometimes it's sentences, but it's over and over again. And such a beautiful, beautiful book. And it is that. It is this repetition to try and make a physically unlivable situation livable and manageable. Yeah, your words literally took me back to like my first year in my MFA program. And I was like, oh my gosh, I have to mention Slater Orchard. I highly recommend that book. But yeah, I totally get what you're saying.
Thank you. Yeah, I do think this is one of my favorite techniques actually in writing, is the repetition. Repeat over and over, because I need to not just process, but tell it to myself over and over. And I think technique-wise, it's a very effective way of actually holding the reader, right? Because they also have to repeat it over and over, and they can either process it or they can either be annoyed by it, but it's gonna go in at some point, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think as writers, we write about the things that hold on to us and won't let go, you know? And so often we are just writing the same thing lots of times because it hasn't let go of us yet.
Mm-hmm. I mean, look at the lines that you repeated in those two poems, Hailey. Like, those specific lines are repeated for a reason. They have an impact. The impact might be different depending on which poem you're reading, but they are repeated for a purpose, which I love.
I mean, Riley, you wrote a whole book about the same event over and over and over. So it's the same thing, just a little larger, right? Yes, each text stands by itself, but when you realize what the narrative is, it actually a repetition in order to process the event.
I'm wondering if I could pop in here with a question. I'm curious if you all could talk about how the literal form of your work might hold trauma. So like the poem on the page or the writing on the page, and how you might use form or space as one like craft move to work with trauma in your writing.
Yes, I would love to talk about that. So The first poem I read was formatted kind of like this, with the 1, 2, 3, 4 with the brief, synopsis of this fairy tale I'm working with, basically, and then prose poetry in between. I did one of those for every fairy tale I worked with. Each fairy tale in here has 3 poems, and it always starts with one that's written like that. And for me, a big part of that was moving from archetype to the personal. So I have the poems like that are more on the archetype level. And then for most of the stories, I also have a poem that's told in some kind of verse form where I'm telling the story and more like the way you might have heard it as a fairy tale. And then I go into a more personal lyric poem. And the reason that I did it that way, I mean, there's lots of reasons I did it that way, but a big reason that I did it that way was when I learned about the ATU folklore classification system. And so I was reading all these fairy tales in these short, just like paragraphs that are just like 4 lines or 5 lines or, 6 lines of just like some folklorist being like, these are the core components of this story. And that fascinated me because even just like reading through a lot of fairy tales, the way they're written down, they are often very dry. They don't hold a lot of the emotion or tell a lot of the emotion. And then seeing it put even more intensely into that form, but it's still all there. The trauma is still there and it's buried. And it's like it's hiding a little bit. But I mean, you read the synopsis and you're like, okay, parents abandon a child in the woods. Like it said so straightforward and matter of factly, but it hits. And that was something I was just really curious about during this process. And again, kind of those obsessive cycles, writing, different poems about the same story in lots of different ways because the story hadn't let go of me yet.
Yeah, over the process of like workshop and revision and editing, a lot of my poems took in very, very different shapes than they did from the first draft that I submitted. And I think part of that was I was trying to keep things too formalized, too structured, too neat and tidy, because I like things neat and tidy. And I was really encouraged by my editors, Emily and Caroline, to like be a bit more messy, maybe play with form in this, maybe try doing more, stretched out pieces, and, play with line breaks, play with, really weird formatting. And so that was, what I started doing, and it ended up really capturing, I felt it captured the physical messiness of the trauma I went through, without being graphic on the page, which I think really helped add just another layer of emphasis to the book.
It's really a hard question, and I'm trying to phrase it in the right way. I think the way the form that I used is all about the space. What kind of space the words need. And it's a literal space, and it's a literal space, but it's also a metaphorical space. One of the stories that Hailey, you mentioned is the Lagrange point. And the Lagrange point is actually a term in physics that talks about 3 celestial masses that orbit and move together in a synchronized way. And 2 of them are large and 1 is a small, like a baby mass or something. And it forces this little mass to move along with the other 2. And they move together in a very synchronized way, but also they never meet together. And what I ended up doing in the book is building and structuring all the rest of the text around these 3 parts of Lagrange story. And in a way, I kind of like actualized the idea of 3 masses moving together, relating to each other, but not really meeting. So creating other spaces in the book. So back to the negative space, I think about the space and how to, almost like a tablecloth, empty table, how do I place things together in a way that the story or the words will make sense?
Thanks for speaking to that. We're getting close to time, so if there's any other questions that any of the other editors want to toss into the space as a wrap up, or if any of the three of you have something burning that you haven't got to yet, now would be a good time to ask those.
I think I'll just say one more thing. I think if I can reach one person on earth with my trauma, personal trauma, and let them relate to it through their own story, I think I can resign. You know, I'm like, that's great.
Well, then you better resign now, Ahuva, because I am obsessed with your book.
I was gonna say, my question was, when I buy copies of y'all's books, like, you're gonna sign it for me, right? Like,
Yeah. With cute little notes.
yeah, exactly.
This is a beautiful transition point. I'm gonna wrap this up here and just let folks know that pre-sales are on the website now. So you can go there if you want to get your hands on one of these books. And all 5 titles are available on the website for pre-orders. The books will be arriving in September. We're really excited to have them. And there's going to be a launch party on September 17th. If you're in Portland, Oregon, we'd love to have you join us. When you pre-order, you can select to pick your book up there if you'd like.